Let's get some questions from the audience, please. Yes.
Thanks for the insight into the mandatory code. It's the first time we've had a chance to really, see the effects of it. My question or observation is that the mandatory code brings everyone together, yes, but one of the consequences, and which is one of the issues we have in our wine industry, is that we have structural problems. But it seems to me that the mandatory code in the dairy industry has actually helped evolve, I guess, the structural issues you've had in the dairy industry. I don't know if you can elaborate on that, but that I think is a positive outcome from what I've heard from you.
Yeah, look, on balance, I would say it's been better than it has otherwise been. Bringing people together through legislation, we can do that in a prison, but we don't seek to do it through that process. Bringing people together through creating an environment where respect in the first instance has to be forced so that it genuinely blossoms into something else, well, that's something quite different. Now, I can't speak for the wine industry. I don't know what your structural problems are. Dairy has some very specific and immediate issues. We deal with probably the most perishable product available, and if a farmer has to shut down production even for a few days, the cows start to dry off, which means that you've got all sorts of problems ramping up productions afterwards. So all of our systems are geared to immediacy. In some respects, even if you have a 3-year contract, if you are going to be honest about the nature of a dairy supply contract, it's actually a daily contract in so many ways. However, having said that, we were able to work through, particularly with the Commonwealth Government, the issues that the dairy industry faced, and we then built a code which suited the dairy industry. Now, there's no doubt that processors are unhappy with some elements of the existing code. I would suggest that to a degree they had that visited upon themselves. But if they come up with reasonable arguments as to why and how the code can be improved, then we'll be all ears. So long as they understand that we'll be doing it from a position that we are partners in this process and that we also have certain expectations as a partner.
You talk about a sort of a massive change from almost a domestic relationship changing to one of equality. That's a change of culture. So because of that change of culture, have you seen a transition of the ownerships of dairies and and then the people that are sitting on those boards that are buying the milk?
That's a really interesting question and a very good one. The dairy industry is an industry which is undergoing pretty substantial change at the moment, and the nature of dairy farming is undergoing and will undergo a substantial evolution going forward. The idea of a dairy farm being this quaint little exercise where mama sits there with a bucket and milks, or we put a few suction cups on and the truck comes along, that still exists, but is very quickly being replaced by more intensive systems, robotics, and the harvesting of all sorts of information. It's difficult to say that the cultural change is all because of the code. The cultural change, in part, is that as these dairy farms become more intense, the herds get larger, so that the farm businesses change from the family farm to businesses and corporations with all of the attendant focus that follows that. My prediction for the industry over the next 10 years is you're going to see more of that. So it's not the family farms that continue will look more like businesses, and they will behave more like businesses. So that you'll see things like, and you see them being installed left, right and centre now, is robotics. So humans don't go anywhere near cows now. The cow presents itself for milking, and the cow gets milked by a robot, and the cow chuffs off back to the paddock or back to the feed barn, wherever they come from. So that change is hard to pull apart and say, well, it was the code that did that. Well, I suspect that business is also doing that. But one thing I will say is that now that farmers are in a competitive, or processors are in a competitive market, their prices they're offering reflect that competition, which has meant that farms can finally start to roll some of that income back into business improvement. And that's where you're starting to see this investment in technology and increasing in farm size. So it's about getting the competition right between the contracting parties and between the competitors who are seeking to buy the milk in the first place.
Other questions? So,
with the relation of publicly available pricing, with the release of publicly available pricing or pricing which is forward forecast, was there a sentiment that was risky from a domestic supply or export opportunity, and have you actually seen a result of that through the process? Has it driven potentially the pricing on the retail shelf or an export price?
There is no doubt that milk and milk-based products are more expensive than they were a few years ago. $1 a litre milk is no longer available. But what we would suggest is that is an outcome of the reality of producing the cost of production. The arrangements which had come to pass in the industry did not reflect the cost of production, which is why farmers were earning $2 an hour and seeing their product on the shelf for less than the price of water. So what you've seen is a manifestation of the reality of the price. Now, that still comes with its own problems. We're still, as a nation, we're still engaged in a number of FTAs or free trade agreements. Milk at the moment is much cheaper out of New Zealand, which means we are now competing with imported cheeses and those sorts of things. So we are still affected by international prices. And we had a number of good years of good prices. We've seen this year, I mean, it's just gone the 1st of June, so the prices are up, and we've seen those prices come down because processors can't afford to offer farmers any more. We can live with that, but the point is we know that the processors are now genuinely competing with each other for that milk, and so that the prices they're offering is what they can afford, not what they think farmers should have.
terrific, Ash.
Yeah, John, does the code reach through to the retailers in any way, shape or form?
No. The grocery code looks after dairy milk products once it goes from the processor's loading dock into the retail chain. The dairy industry code is specifically aimed at the relationship between processor and farmer.
Terrific. Sir, you had a question?
Just a quick one. And I feel sorry for the dairy industry I feel sorry for a dairy producer only getting paid $2 an hour for his effort. When you actually came back to look at the industry as a whole and pricing, I mean, you would have gone back and looked at how much does a dairy producer need to make to break even or stay in business? Was that the starting point?
Not really. And the reason is that the dairy farm is still a business like any other. It's got to operate like a business. It's got to know what its costs, inputs are in relation to what it needs to recover to make itself work. Many businesses during this period stopped. People just stopped dairying. If you drive around the Fleurieu Peninsula now, you can see any number of dairy sheds which hadn't had a cow through it in the last 5, 6, 10 years. It's a tough gig in those tough times, like any other business. It wasn't our intention to create an environment where businesses were automatically rescued because of the operation of a code. We still have to remain competitive. It's our duty to remain competitive as farmers, but we've got to do it in an environment where at least the contractual environment and nothing else, is executed in a fair fashion. And that's really what the code was about, was creating, spreading the risk and creating parity of contracting strength.
No, thank you for that. Just another point on spreading the risk. You made mention that the poor dairy farmer, if he doesn't get his milk to market, it's been a perishable good. I mean, there's a lot of similarity to the grapes getting to a processing point and the window of getting it in there. And if there's a delay of not getting it in there, the consequences are quite huge, but are actually borne by the grower in our instance.
The short answer is I can't answer that question.
No.
Maybe there's a couple of opportunities. If we can start feeding wine grapes to dairy cows, we can create a brand spanking new product, which will be available through BWS. Actually, I think we're onto something there.
Shiraz cappuccinos.
Yeah.
Nice.
And equally, you've got to figure out, so one of the things that I wrote into a couple of the contracts that I actually drafted for processors was a clear declaration as to when the transfer of ownership occurred. In the contracts I wrote, the ownership occurs at the point that the milk passes through the coupling attached to the vat, from the vat to the farm truck. So that once the milk was in the hose going to the truck, it was already the processor's milk. And it's that precise.
Yeah. John, you mentioned in your code you exclude the artisan processors. The wine industry is similar sort of demographics. You've got the small boutique wineries and obviously the larger corporates. What process did you go through in trying to ascertain what that cut-off level was, and what sort of consultation did you go through, and what sort of factors were taken into account?
Sure, that's a really good question, and the answer is really simple. Any cut-off point is arbitrary. 61 kilometres an hour is over the speed limit, 59 is below the speed limit. The law is full of arbitrariness, and we settled on an arbitrary approach. The Australian Taxation Office will describe what a medium to large enterprise is. And it's basically any enterprise with a turnover of $10 million and or 100 employees. And that's the threshold. So businesses like La Casa del Formaggio, brilliant cheeses, Beston's Global Foods, exquisite cheeses that come out of them, they are both over that $10 million a year threshold, so they then have to apply to the code. If they have less than $10 million a year in their business turnover, then they're still obliged to follow the code only to the extent where they act in good faith, but the other components of the code no longer apply. Asking a small artisan cheesemaker to then employ a lawyer to draft a code-compliant document and then post it up on their website, assuming that they have one, is too much of an ask. And it was never the ACCC's or the dairy industry's point that those relationships were in any way unhealthy. Those relationships were much more like a symbiosis than parasite and host.
One final question. Bruce, would you like to make a comment?
No, but I will. Oh, no, thank you. I admire the work that has been done here and the learnings coming from it. And John, thank you for your public service too, by the way. Time frames, you've had a number of signposts along the way. I was asked at morning tea how long this takes to actually happen, and I said, I reckon it happens in under 18 months by the time you go through the consultative process, the parties around the table, the back and forth with Treasury and the ACCC and all that, and in your case, primary industry and others. Can you share a sense of time frame for us, please, sir?
In this case, from ACCC investigation to a functional code would have been 2.5 years from memory. I imagine if there was sufficient, and that was with sufficient political will, if there was political urgency, I would suspect that the metamucil of political urgency would have had things passing through the system a bit more quickly. But you're still looking at 18 months because there are a number of steps that you have to go through. And the simple act of drafting an instrument through Parliamentary Council, who actually write these things out, in of itself is a time-consuming and cautious process, and that's just one element of the production process. The other thing is that built into the code was a review timeline, which means that the code itself acknowledged that it may not be perfect, and therefore, on 2 occasions into the future, by dint of legislation, the code will be reviewed to test for its effectiveness and see if there are improvements to be made.
Ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in thanking Mr. John Elferink.